I was not particularly excited for Moana 2 when it got announced. I didn't think it was destined to fail or anything, I just didn't see much reason to get excited for it, considering the relative lack of marketing, Disney's last attempt at something like this, and their almost exclusively mediocre lineup of animated films in the last few years. But to be perfectly honest, I was legitimately surprised. Not in a good way though, in fact I'm honestly quite shocked at how terrible this movie was. In fact, it's arguably one of the most pointless and uninspired sequels I've ever seen. Okay, well, let's take a look at what we're actually working with here. The story takes place sometime after the events of the first movie, with Moana regularly sailing away from her village in search of other civilizations to form partnerships with. But all that gets put on hold when she's put in charge of a new mission. Nalo, the storm god, is threatening her home, forcing her and a gaggle of new friends from her village to journey across the ocean to stop him. On the way, she meets up with Maui again, and they team up one more time to stop another god and save her village. It's legitimately difficult to talk about the premise of this movie in any meaningful detail because there's so little of worth to actually discuss, and none of the storylines present really connect all that well. Moana's goal of forming connections between her village and other communities has virtually no bearing on the plot. Her village, as far as we can see, seems to be managing just fine, and she doesn't seem to have any clear ambition for what she wants her village to be or how outside help is going to assist with that. Not that it matters anyway though, since the journey she goes through doesn't really tie into these desires anyway. They don't show her meeting any strangers to recruit for the adventure, or show her having to convince anyone or develop her persuasion or negotiation skills or anything like that. The closest we get is the Kakamora from the first movie returning, and the movie tries to make them a little sympathetic with them losing their home and a lot of their people. They end up joining her, but it doesn't really serve Moana's motivations in any way because it's framed as them recruiting her instead of the other way around. And even then, the sympathetic angle doesn't really work since their backstory is just delivered as an exposition dump, and the one Kakamora member who becomes part of Moana's group is given no distinct personality. He plays such a minute role in the story that on a number of occasions the scene would cut to him and I would just be sitting there like, wait, he's still here? Also, the Kakamora have this giant blobfish creature, and it does the screaming goat meme because evidently Disney didn't learn their lesson from Thor: Love and Thunder.
They also scream quite a lot.
Then there's the villains. I've seen a lot of people over the last few years complaining about the lack of proper villains in recent Disney movies. The conniving, threatening, and most importantly entertaining villains that used to play such a big role in Disney, mostly replaced with no villains at all or twist villains with horribly contrived plans and who often feel like a completely different character once they're revealed to be evil. That was his mistake.
What the fuck, dude?
However, if the villains of Moana 2 are what Disney have had up their sleeves this whole time, we really haven't been missing much. Nalo is supposed to be the main thread of the story, but he has zero presence throughout the narrative. And when I say that, I don't mean that his actions aren't seen or felt by the audience. Well, okay, I do mean that, but I mostly mean that he literally isn't present for basically the entire movie. The characters talk about him and mention all the terrible things he's done to people we know nothing about, but even in the climax, he's never there for the audience to see. The only time he ever actually appears is in a Marvel-style mid-credit scene meant to build up hype for a possible Moana 3. Disney, I know you're trying to get us excited at the prospect of seeing more of this guy, but could you maybe start by just giving him to us the first time? There is another villain named Matangi who is basically Nalo's henchwoman and is slightly better than him. She's actually in the movie for one thing, which, yeah, that's the bar the movie is setting, alright. Maui goes to confront her, and we initially only see her in shadows and sneaking out of sight right before you can get a good look at her. She kind of put me in mind of Eris from Sinbad, the DreamWorks movie. She has a similar kind of sinister, playful energy and mysteriousness. There was this one shot where she was sitting on this crescent moon and it looked exactly like that one shot of Taylor Swift from Cats, but aside from that, it was a pretty good introduction and I wanted to see what the movie was gonna do with her. And then they do absolutely nothing with her. She barely does anything villainous throughout the story. I mean, yeah, she kidnaps Maui, but she doesn't hurt him in any way or seem to have any kind of plans for him. She just meets Moana at the halfway point of the film, and without even any convincing on Moana's part, Matangi just sends her and Maui to defeat Nalo for no adequately explained reason. If there was any foreshadowing that she disliked Nalo and wanted him stopped, it was completely lost on me. The movie took what looked like a genuinely intimidating and intriguing villain, and as soon as they were given a proper spotlight, just removes her from the plot immediately. It was really disappointing. Then there are Moana and Maui, who are probably the most underwritten parts of this whole movie because they just straight up do not have character arcs in this. In the original, there were very personal and emotional journeys that these characters went through. Moana wanted to see what the world outside of her island had to offer and also wanted to prove herself capable of accomplishing her mission. And Maui wanted to restore his status as a hero after being disgraced, only to learn that being a real hero means prioritizing the needs of others over himself. Here, though, there is barely any source of drama that these characters have to struggle with. There are no lessons learned or mistakes to correct or character flaws to be overcome. The whole movie is just them progressing from point A to point B, and by the end of the film, they feel pretty much the exact same personality-wise. It's honestly so frustrating to watch. I know that Disney haven't exactly been on the top of their game in the last few years, but I didn't think I would need to explain to a 100-year-old movie studio that character development is kind of a necessary part of storytelling. But let's say that you're not concerned about that, and that you're happy to just see these two back in action. Even at a more basic level, there's a surprising lack of interaction between these two for something that was meant to be like the main appeal of the original film. Moana and Maui don't interact with each other once for the entire first half of the movie, and Maui spends the first half of the movie kidnapped and faffing around until he becomes relevant to the story. Then, when they finally do interact, there isn't even much in the way of fanfare. Most of their interactions are just plot exposition with barely any of the fun banter they used to have. The only other characters that I feel I should talk about are the 3 villagers that Moana recruits for the adventure. They're worthless. They contribute basically nothing to the plot, which I would at least be able to somewhat overlook if they were interesting characters, but they are absolutely not. They're each given one very basic personality trait, and almost every single line of dialogue they have is just them displaying that trait without any sort of nuance or variety. The characters from Strange World were more memorable than this, a movie that nobody ever talks about outside of conversations about how nobody ever talks about it. I went into Moana 2 with low expectations. I assumed it would just be another mediocre movie from a company that, for the most part, has been phoning it in for a while now. Instead, we got a movie that failed to live up to even that. Even with every reason not to, I wanted to give Disney the benefit of the doubt that the not great Frozen 2 was something they could improve on with the next sequel they did. But Moana 2 made me realize that, as mid as Frozen 2 was, we really didn't know how good we had it back then. And now I can't help but think, if Disney were willing to put out a completely nothing sequel like Moana 2 once, should I really have faith that Zootopia 2 and Frozen 3 and 4 won't be similar? I guess we'll just have to wait and see. But what I will say is, Disney, I know I'm not some fancy schmancy executive like yourselves, but every single one of your tentpole brands has been suffering for a while now, and you shouldn't be surprised if that loyalty from your fans doesn't last forever. Just think it over. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters Heather Reed, Zelda, Radio Payo, and Moon Goddesses. Thank you so much for the support.